a night of devastation in Paris, let's try for some big picture context. To offer their help in Detroit, Saeed Khan, professor of Near East Studies. From Ottawa again, security expert Ray Boisvert. And here in studio, Samantha Nutt, co-founder of War Child, and Brian Stewart, former longtime CBC News foreign correspondent. First of all, Ray, let me do it quickly with you. Nobody has claimed responsibility yet. Most analysts are kind of suggesting this is likely ISIS, given a number of different events. Do you think this is ISIS?
Well, we have to be very careful and be cautious about distinguishing what is ISIS as an ISIS coordinated, ISIS that's been inspired. And I think in this case, it'll probably prove itself out to be more of the inspired variety. There may be some logistical assistance, there may be some direction on targeting. But unlike the Mumbai attack, that was very, very much a foreign-based operation with ongoing advice and communications, this, I think, was probably lone actors clustered together with a decent plan, but certainly intended to be very local, but probably inspired by the ISIS theme, or perhaps even, we'll find out later, Al-Qaeda senior leadership. All
right, well, that is the other option. One assumes, excuse me, Brian, and that's Al-Qaeda. They have done these sort of big operations with multiple targets before.
And they are desperate to get back into the main headlines because they feel that main headlines have been stolen by ISIS. But the reality is, and it's a sad, sad reality, is it doesn't really take one organization of great skilled people to pull off these kind of attacks on extraordinarily soft targets, just massacring civilians. Yes, it takes some skill to smuggle the weapons in. Yes, certainly it takes skill to get around in French intelligence and counter terrorism. But the actual killings, the attacks themselves, could be launched by a breakaway from ISIS, a breakaway from Al-Qaeda. It's one of the great nightmares of the security forces right now, is trying to pin down what is the plan.
All right. Let me look at the last couple of weeks of things that have been happening in the Middle East and through pushing westward to tonight here in Paris. Keep these things in mind as we move on in the discussion. You know, in late October, you have the situation in the Sinai where the Russian plane crashed, 224 people killed in that. Then you move on to November 9th in Afghanistan, where you have 7 people beheaded. In November 12th in Beirut, just yesterday, suicide bombers, 2 different bombs killed 43 people, injured more than a couple of hundred. Also today, aside from what happened in Paris, you have in Baghdad suicide bombs again, killing more than a couple of dozen, injuring more than 60. When you look at this pattern of things, Saeed, that's been happening just in the last couple of weeks, many of them either claimed by ISIS or a lot of people thinking they were ISIS, either inspired or directed. What is that telling you?
Well, let's add to that, Peter. Last month, 120 killed in Ankara, Turkey. So we have an awful lot of carnage out of the Middle East that's been occurring. But we also have to go ahead and recognize that at the same time, there is an escalation in the kinds of airstrikes and the military involvement of several parties that are acting over there, including France, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. So what we're finding then is a general escalation of violence on both sides, and unfortunately it seems to be feeding a counterstrike with one coming in one direction, and then now, as we see in Paris, coming in the other direction, stabbing westward.
Sam, what are you seeing here?
I agree with Saeed. I think we are, even if you just look at that list in recent weeks, and if you look at what's happened over the past year, we are seeing an escalation. We're seeing increasing sophistication, better coordination, and I think the big point here is that this is not a traditional enemy in the military sense. This is ISIS, if indeed it turns out to be ISIS, is much more of a movement. It has tentacles everywhere, and when it plants those seeds, it follows these kind of non-traditional means to invoke fear, to spread terror, and it's remarkably successful. And even if you just look at what's happened, as I said, over the past year, the fact that these attacks are happening with increasing frequency should be extremely concerning for every Western leader out there.
You've been focused a lot on France in the last couple of months. Why France? Why is this happening tonight in France?
Well, if you look at France in particular, and I've been looking at looking at youth extremism more generally and homegrown terrorism within Western countries, and if you look at France, there are a number of issues that have come up lately that might have made them a more pronounced enemy when it comes to groups such as ISIS. I mean, historically, they have been a very popular foe with very radical groups for a number of different reasons. But when we're talking specifically about ISIS, for example, increasing bombing activities across Syria that started at the end of September. If you look at the rise of the prominence of the far-right movement and some of the rhetoric that's been coming from that group in recent months, if you look at their overall vulnerability, both geographically and then in terms of the numbers of fighters that they've had who've gone off to join ISIS and returning fighters. So there are a number of risk factors at play that would have made France a much more vulnerable target, at least within the European context.
What is likely to be the impact on global security, and I guess more specifically on Western security, Ray, as a result of what's happened tonight?
Well, there's going to be a lot of questions asked, there should be. There always are after these events. Somehow, there's a number of persons who got together, able to acquire small arms of automatic weapons. They were able to create, it appears, some improvised explosive devices. Not at the highest end of sophistication, but enough to ask some very serious questions. The challenge for all of these Western environments, including especially Paris, for all the reasons Samantha mentioned, and I also agree that it's part of the pushback, it's part of the way to relieve pressure on the battlefront is to try to invoke some actual actions in the rear guard sort of thing, such as in Paris or in other jurisdictions. As a result, a lot of the agencies will be looking at their target groups, but they have quite often too many targets to manage, and there are a lot of pressures around things such as the debate we're having in this country over C-51, and what is the right level of security, invasiveness in an open and free society, whereas our people who are highly motivated, and especially for the reasons Samantha just underlined, I think domestic politics are also that really understated important driver in this scenario, because you could be inspired by events overseas, but quite often, in my view, the tipping point will be quite often things that happen closer to home.
Brian?
Yeah, I'm particularly concerned about the public reaction across the band of countries that are under attack. And I don't actually necessarily believe that ISIS needs the incentive of Allied bombing attacks to want to attack as best it can in the West. I think that's its objective anyways. But it's 10 months since Charlie Hebdo. 10 months ago, we thought that was probably the worst we could see. Now we see something 10 times worse, 20 times worse. What happens if the attacks go down to every 2 months instead of every 10 months? At what point do the public...
And if they keep moving westward.
Westward,
as
indeed.
They seem to be doing.
But what happens if the public really, it's all very well, we can say, have to be cool, have to be serene under attack, but eventually, Paris looked like it was really rattled tonight, understandably so, and who doesn't sympathize with that? At what point might governments start having to think about detentions, large-scale detentions of those who've come back from serving with ISIS, for instance? This kind of acts that Canada brought in
October
1970, the War Measures Act, the apprehended insurrection. I really worry, because I don't want to go down that road, that may be the road that governments are going to feel pushed towards.
Saeed, do you sense that could be one of the outcomes of tonight?
Tragically so, Peter. I'm sure that President Hollande is going to have an awful lot of pressure to go ahead and act decisively, act visibly on the fronts of securitization, surveillance, and also mass sweep of particularly certain communities in order to demonstrate that he's doing something about that. Because not only does he have to worry about the threat of a further insurrection within France, but he also has to worry about people like Marine Le Pen and the National Front Party. The domestic politics in this is definitely going to play a very pivotal part, and it's going to play a part all throughout Europe, with some of the discussions happening even today among Republican presidential candidates in the United States, exploiting this opportunity to say that refugees and immigration must be curtailed, both in the United States as well as in Europe.
Sam?
I just wanted to add to that I certainly think a crackdown is unavoidable, but I also want to just raise the fact that France did do that in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and there was a much more robust police presence, military presence right across the country, and it had little impact in terms of being able to prevent this occurrence. So we need to keep that in mind and keep all of these issues in balance when it comes to, well, what is the appropriate response, and can we actually make ourselves safer? The reality is that in this new world order, that is extremely difficult to do, and we have woken up to what is a very new geopolitical reality.
Well, they had a robust response. As you said, it clearly wasn't enough to prevent what happened tonight, but one of the things they didn't do was young French who went over and were fighting with ISIS, who returned to France, were able to return to France and not be detained. Quite a couple of hundred of them.
Well, that's true, and knowing where they are and what they're up to is critically important. But we also need to remember that not all of those will come back as much more sort of hardened terrorists. Some of them will have come back extremely disillusioned and frustrated and disaffected with their experiences and the trauma that they have sustained. And there have been a number of young French men in particular who've come back, and who one of whom was detained in Guantanamo, and who've been very outspoken, trying to make sure that young people know what they're getting themselves into, and try to de-propagandize this so that young people are more informed and will make better choices.
Okay, I'm going to have to take a break in a moment, but Ray, do you see a much tougher kind of domestic reaction to this in Western countries in terms of how they prepare themselves?
Well, inevitably, we'll see it in a physical sense because security forces will become more prominent, especially for those who travel in Western Europe. You're quite often surprised to see the number of military-clad paramilitaries around airports and train stations and so on. That'll probably get amplified for, as Samantha said, for probably unequal sort of success at the far end. But inevitably, that's what keeps people feeling a little more comfortable as they travel through these stations. On the security intelligence side, it will mean them going out there and trying to recruit more access, more sources, more points of information. I suspect they'll also look at a lot more signals intelligence pieces. The whole issue, the debate again around the issue of the Snowden revelations, well, this is in fact the sort of things that often lead to some investigational leads. The question is, how much invasiveness will Western societies willing to have to deal with in order to provide perhaps some higher level of security? But there is no optimum state here. At the end of the day, we all live in free societies, and it's up to the security services to be very nimble, but be very subtle, because if they're too oppressive or seen as too aggressive, it's very counterproductive.
All right, I got to take a quick short break, but we'll be right back with more on the impact of today's attacks on Paris in just a moment. All right, we still got a couple of minutes to talk about this. Brian, just before we broke, you wanted to say something.
Well, I think we're still trying to absorb the full scale of this. We seem to be moving from out of a situation we think of as peace into some form of kind of sinister twilight where things are not quite peace and they're not going to be peace. I think what Ray said earlier, that the lights will be burning late in the security services of the world. And if we have any relief at all tonight, even if we can use that awful term when it was so many dead, it's that the attacks were at least contained in Paris. I thought when I first started hearing such coordinated attacks, we'd be having hits in Brussels and Amsterdam and Nice and Bonn, for instance. But all the security forces of Europe must be extraordinarily nervous and tense tonight.
You'd think so, especially when if it's ISIS, you look at what's happened these last couple of weeks. There's a pattern here. So it may not have been tonight in Amsterdam or London or wherever, but there are days to follow. What's the impact of this going to be on a number of other major events that are coming up, whether that be the continuing story of the refugees and the migrants, or whether it's the Paris Climate Conference, where all the leaders of the world are going to be sitting in Paris, not far from these attack sites tonight. Sam, what do you think?
I think that especially throughout Europe, there will be certainly a significant chill when it comes to the refugee file and the conversations around how many people are going to be allowed to relocate, the extent to which they will have to now go through even enhanced security procedurals. That's going to be a really critical question. I think it's going to be a critical question in North America as well when we look to trying to reach our target of 25,000 by the end of this year and making sure that we have rigorous enough processes. I do think it has implications for the climate change conference. At the same time, I think the tendency will be to show solidarity with France, especially during this very tragic moment, and to come forward and to unify within France as world leaders.
Saeed?
I think the most profound issue and soul-searching that's going to happen, Peter, is about Europe and the European Union as it is today, a borderless entity. Belgium is already now re-implementing passport control along its border with France, and it's most likely that this is going to be at least a debate that's going to become very fertile and very volatile over the next few months. And it's going to be interesting to see if the EU can remain the EU as we understand it today.
All right, Ray, briefly.
Well, I suspect there's a couple of things. There's a lot of pressure on politicians to probably apply a lot more screening to those refugees. And of course, the clock is ticking. People want to see them arrive and find sanctuary. But there'll be a requirement to use some more advanced approaches, advanced analytics and other things to get at the information, be able to do the kind of processing we want to do in a safe but effective, efficient way. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, that security agenda just never is ever off that international agenda, which is unfortunate because the economy, migrants, so many other things should probably be reigning supreme, but we just can't seem to escape this cycle of violence.
All right. It'll be interesting to see whether Canada, the new government, reassesses its view about pulling the CF-18s out of the combat mission. Brian, you get the last
I think
word.
all governments are going to have to return back to the question of Syria. I think Russia and France will be talking very seriously after this. I think everybody has got to realize that we have a volcano bubbling away in the heart of the Middle East here, in Iraq and Syria. And most terrorist experts and most security experts don't think there's going to be much of a settling down, a calming down, until somehow these problems are calmed.
All right. Thank you all. Good discussion here tonight. Brian, Sam, Saeed, and Ray. We'll be right back with more in a moment.